What if one morning, success simply stopped meaning anything? Good evening, and welcome back to Wisdom by the Fireside. In tonight's live story, we follow a man who built an empire out of ideas and then abandoned it without warning. He wasn't ruined by scandal, greed, or loss. He was undone by something quieter, something that creeps into every modern soul, chasing too much, too fast. When Evan Lewis walked out of his own company on a Tuesday morning, no one knew what had happened to him. But what he discovered afterward, far from Silicon Valley's glass towers, would redefine what it means to live. So, what makes a man walk away from everything he's ever built? It was 8:47 a.m., Tuesday, April 14th, 2023. The boardroom at Link Systems smelled like espresso and tension, a usual morning at one of the Valley's top AI firms. The wall-sized screen glowed with a slide titled Q2 Expansion Projections. Evan Lewis, founder, CEO, visionary, stood at the head of the glass table. To his right sat investors, to his left, lawyers. At the far end, a nervous intern taking notes like scripture. Evan's hair, once jet black, was now streaked with gray at 42. His eyes, cold blue, steady, scanned the chart before him. He'd seen it all before. Quarterly growth, market dominance, words like scaling, monetization, user stickiness. They used to thrill him. Now they felt like wallpaper he'd stared at too long. And if we push the predictive model update early, said Maya, his chief operations officer, we'll beat the competition by at least 6 months. The room buzzed with approval. Evan should have smiled. Instead, he blinked, just once, as if something inside him had quietly snapped. Evan, Maya said. You're on mute, by the way. He wasn't. He just hadn't said anything. Everyone looked up. The only sound was the hum of the AC and a drone camera filming the meeting for internal archives. Then Evan closed his laptop. Not abruptly, not dramatically. Just a quiet click, like a man closing the lid of a coffin. He looked around the table, the same faces who'd once believed he was unstoppable. And with the calm of a man stepping out of a burning house, he said, I think I'm done. No one laughed, not even the intern. Done with what? Asked Robert, the CFO. With this, Evan said softly. All of it. He picked up his phone, slid it into his pocket, and walked out before anyone could move. The glass door whispered shut behind him. The room stayed frozen for several seconds before Robert muttered, He's kidding, right? He wasn't. Outside sunlight pooled on the pavement like liquid gold. The air smelled of citrus and exhaust, San Mateo's strange cocktail of tech money in California spring. Evan walked past the row of parked Teslas, removed his smartwatch, and dropped it into the trash can near the exit. Then he kept walking. No press conference, no farewell email, no dramatic post on LinkedIn, just a man in a tailored gray suit walking aimlessly toward nowhere, while his billion-dollar company imploded in real time. Within hours, news alerts flashed across CNBC and Bloomberg. Link Systems CEO walks out mid-meeting. Sources cite possible breakdown. Investors panicked. Employees texted each other in disbelief. On social media, hashtags bloomed like weeds. # where's Evan? Hashtag CEO gone, Tuesday walkout. But Evan wasn't watching. He wasn't anywhere to be found. By sunset, he'd driven his Range Rover north out of the Bay Area. No destination, just roads that felt like freedom. He turned off his phone before the first voicemail arrived. Somewhere between Sacramento and Redding, the highway began to blur. Rain streaked across the windshield. The digital clock on the dashboard flickered, 11:07 p.m. He pulled over at a roadside motel, paid cash for the room, and fell face first onto the bed. The next morning, he stared at the cracked ceiling and felt nothing. No regret, no relief, just emptiness, vast and still. When he finally stepped outside, the mountain air was cool, quiet, almost holy in its indifference. He whispered to no one in particular, "Who am I?" without it. The question hung in the mist like smoke, but the world doesn't let billionaires vanish quietly. 2 days later, his face filled every newsfeed. The brilliant CEO who'd lost it. Commentators debated burnout, narcissism, even drug use. Psychologists on podcasts speculated about identity collapse. But none of them knew what really happened in that boardroom. Maybe even Evan didn't. He rented a small cabin near the Oregon coast, a forgotten fishing town called Brookings, where the Wi-Fi was bad and nobody cared who you'd been. He spent his mornings walking to the shore, his evenings staring at the fire. No screens, no stock charts, no purpose, just silence. And in that silence, he began to hear something he hadn't heard in years, the faint hum of his own thoughts. He didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning. Because somewhere on that rainy highway, he hadn't just walked away from a company. He'd walked straight into the hardest meeting of his life, the one with himself. The news broke faster than he could disappear. Within 12 hours, every major outlet had published a version of the same headline. Evan Lewis, the visionary CEO of Link Systems, vanishes without explanation. By midnight, the story had taken on a life of its own. Analysts compared him to Howard Hughes. Psychologists called it an existential burnout episode. Shareholders called it betrayal. And somewhere between the theories and the think pieces, the real Evan Lewis became a myth, a ghost the internet was determined to resurrect. But in truth, he was just a man, sitting in a diner off Interstate 5, staring into a cup of black coffee that had gone cold. The waitress, name tag Diane, filled his cup without asking. "You look like you lost something," she said. Evan forced a smile. "Yeah, you could say that." She shrugged, sliding him a plate of eggs and toast. "People lose a lot around here. Wallets, jobs, marriages. Coffee helps most of it." He nodded politely. She had no idea she was talking to a man who once sat across from senators and billionaires. Or maybe that was the point. She didn't care. He paid in cash, left too large a tip, and walked out into the fog. The neon sign buzzed behind him. Terry's Diner, open 24 hours. He didn't know it yet, but that neon glow would find him again. Meanwhile, back in California, chaos reigned. The Link Systems stock dropped 22% in 2 days. Employees whispered rumors in Slack channels that Evan had a breakdown, or that he'd been forced out, or that he'd joined some kind of tech cult in Nevada. Maya, his COO, was flooded with messages from journalists. Please comment on Mr. Lewis's mental state. She ignored them all, until one message from an unknown number appeared on her phone. "He's safe. Don't look for me." EL, no emoji, no punctuation beyond the period, just that. Maya stared at the screen for a long time. Then she deleted the message. She'd known him long enough to understand what that meant. He wasn't coming back. For weeks, Evan drove north, stopping at motels with names that sounded like promises. Sunset Inn, Whispering Pines, Traveler's Rest. He wasn't running from anyone. He was running from why. Every time he turned on the radio, his name echoed back through static. Podcasts dissecting his meltdown, old colleagues analyzing his legacy. He switched the dial to silence. One night outside Grants Pass, Oregon, he parked near a rest stop and watched trucks roar past under the rain. His headlights illuminated the "Welcome to Oregon" sign. The border felt like a threshold between who he'd been and who he might become. He whispered, half laughing to himself, "I guess I'm unemployed now." Then he switched off the engine. He found the cabin by accident. It was listed under long-term rentals on a community bulletin board beside a laundromat. One photo, weathered shingles, ivy climbing up the wall, ocean fog curling around the windows. He called the number, spoke to an older man named Bill, who just said, "You quiet?" "Yeah," Evan replied. "Good, it's yours. 400 a month? Bring cash." That was that. The place was small. One room, one window, one wood stove. The silence was almost too loud. He set his laptop on the counter, but never turned it on. Days bled into each other. He read old novels, scribbled thoughts on napkins, learned how to cook eggs without burning them. For the first time in years, no one needed anything from him. No meetings, no investors, no charts. Just wind, salt air, and time. At first he thought the emptiness would kill him, but something strange happened instead. He started noticing things again. The sound of rain on the tin roof, the way the ocean mist rolled in like breath, the distant bark of a dog at night, the old woman who waved from her porch every morning, whether he waved back or not. Life had rhythm here, slow, unpolished, unoptimized. He'd built algorithms that predicted human behavior, with 93% accuracy. Yet he'd never predicted this, the peace that came from having no signal at all. Still, there were nights when the ghost returned. The voice of his father, the clink of champagne glasses from investor parties, the echo of applause when Lynx hit its first billion-dollar valuation. He used to think applause meant validation. Now it just sounded like noise. One night, lying awake, he finally said it out loud. "I don't know who I am without my title." The room didn't answer, but the silence was kind enough not to argue. A month later, a letter arrived in the rusty mailbox outside his cabin. No return address, just his name, Evan Lewis, written in a familiar looping script. Inside was a single line on plain stationery. "You don't get to disappear forever." Monsieur Maya. He folded the letter neatly, slid it under the drawer, and stared at the sea until it blurred. He wasn't ready to be found. Not yet. That night, as the fire in the stove flickered low, Evan realized something he hadn't before. The world had kept moving without him. The company, the fame, the endless chase, all of it went on. He had stepped out, and nothing had collapsed. So, if the machine didn't need him anymore, what would he do with himself now? The first thing Evan noticed about the cabin was how it breathed. In the mornings, the wood expanded with the sea's damp air, groaning softly like it was alive. At night, when the temperature dropped, the walls exhaled with tiny pops, a sound that would have once annoyed him, but now felt almost like conversation. He had no agenda, no calendar alerts, no one waiting for his signature. Just the silence, raw, patient, endless. It was strange how loud silence could be once you stopped drowning it out. The cabin had come furnished in the way only forgotten places do. Half a couch, one chipped mug, and a bookshelf leaning at a polite angle. The first book he pulled from it was Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. He read the first 3 pages, then fell asleep with it on his chest. When he woke up, the morning fog was thick as milk. The Pacific crashed beyond the hill, heavy, relentless, ancient. Evan sat on the porch steps in his t-shirt and socks, holding that same mug of black coffee he'd been drinking every morning since he'd arrived. It tasted burnt, but real. He thought of the coffee machine in the Lynx Systems boardroom, a gleaming chrome beast that cost more than most cars. He remembered how his assistant used to hand him a cup before meetings. Oat milk, no foam, 1 pump vanilla. Here it was just coffee. Bitter, honest, unfiltered. He almost laughed. Maybe that's what I needed all along. For weeks, he barely spoke to another human being. He'd drive into the small town of Brookings, twice a week for groceries, canned soup, eggs, cereal, batteries. The cashier at the local market, an older man named Curtis, would nod politely. No small talk, no recognition. And that anonymity was priceless. The cabin was a place where Evan Lewis, CEO, didn't exist. Here, he could just be the quiet man in the green jacket who forgot to shave. But solitude is never just peace. It's also confrontation. Without deadlines or distractions, the mind turns inward, and not always kindly. At night, memories crept in like fog under the door. He saw the face of his father, Robert Lewis, a factory worker from Ohio who never smiled unless he was fixing something with his hands. He heard his voice low and sharp. "Don't waste your mind on dreams, son. Build something that lasts." Evan had spent his entire life trying to do exactly that. He'd built a company from a garage idea into a global empire. But in the process, he'd turned himself into a product too. Optimized, efficient, marketable. Now, stripped of everything, he realized he'd built something that lasted for everyone except himself. One night, a storm rolled in from the coast. Winds howled through the trees, and the power went out. For hours, the only light came from the fire he'd managed to keep alive in the stove. He sat in front of it, cross-legged, listening to the crackle and hiss. It reminded him of something his therapist had once said, back when he still had a therapist. "You confuse movement with meaning, Evan. You think if you keep moving, you'll stay alive. But what if stillness is the only way to find yourself again?" At the time, he'd dismissed it. Now, in the flicker of that lonely fire, he wondered if that woman had been the only one who truly saw him. The next morning, the world was washed clean. Branches littered the ground, and a fallen sign leaned against the road. Seaside Cafe, 2 miles. Something in him stirred. Maybe boredom, maybe curiosity, maybe hunger for a voice other than his own. He grabbed his coat and followed the road. The cafe was small, the kind of place that hadn't changed since the 70s. The bell above the door jingled as he walked in. Inside, the air smelled of bacon grease, coffee, and old stories. Behind the counter stood a woman in her 50s, wiping down a tray. Her hair was tied in a loose bun, her eyes alert but kind. "Morning," she said. "You look like you walked out of the ocean." "Almost," Evan said, smiling faintly. "Storm got the power out at my place." "Then you're lucky we still have gas stoves," she said. "Sit wherever you want." He did, by the window, where the sunlight pooled in golden ribbons. The waitress brought him eggs and toast, and for a moment, everything felt simple. Not happy, but simple. When he went to pay, he noticed the old espresso machine behind the counter. Stainless steel. Beautiful, but leaking from one side. "You know," he said, "I could fix that." She raised an eyebrow. "You any good with machines?" He hesitated, then said, "I used to be." She smiled. "Then maybe you can earn your breakfast tomorrow." That was the first time Evan Lewis agreed to work since the day he walked out of Link Systems. He didn't know it then, but that small favor, tightening a few bolts on a forgotten coffee maker, would mark the beginning of a very different kind of empire. And as he stepped back into the sea air, something warm tugged at him from within. Faint, but undeniable. Not triumph, not relief. Something deeper. The first heartbeat of purpose. The cafe owner kept her word. When Evan returned the next morning, she pointed toward the back counter and said, "Espresso machine's still leaking, Mr. Fix-It." He smiled faintly. "Call me Evan." "Marlene," she replied, "and careful with that wrench. It's older than both of us." As he bent to tighten the copper valve, the machine gave a low hiss, the kind of mechanical sigh that meant progress. He had always been good with systems, whether circuits, software, or people. But fixing something physical, something you could touch and hear and smell, carried a satisfaction he'd forgotten. When the first clean line of espresso poured into the cup, Marlene clapped. "Would you look at that? I might keep you around." He didn't know if she was joking, but the idea didn't sound bad. That afternoon back at the cabin, Evan finally opened his laptop for the first time in weeks. Not to check stocks or emails or the world. He just needed someone to talk to. The screen flickered to life, its glow foreign in the dim room. He scrolled through his contacts until one name caught his eye, Dr. Ramirez. He hadn't spoken to her in almost a year. She'd been his therapist during the last 2 years at Link Systems, back when the anxiety had become impossible to hide. He'd stopped going after she told him something that scared him more than burnout. "You're addicted to achievement," she'd said. "Not success, achievement. The constant proof that you're enough." He'd laughed back then, called it poetic nonsense. Now he wasn't laughing. He hesitated before clicking Start Call. The ringing tone echoed in the cabin. Once, twice. Then her face appeared, calm, familiar, half-shadowed by a desk lamp. "Evan," she said softly, "I was wondering when you'd show up again." He almost smiled. "Guess I ran out of places to hide." "I heard about your walkout," she said. "How are you holding up?" He thought about lying, about saying something detached and clever. Instead, he exhaled. "I don't know who I am anymore." Dr. Ramirez nodded as though she'd been expecting that answer. "Then maybe that's finally a good place to start." They talked for nearly an hour. He told her about the cabin, the storms, the diner, the silence. She listened without judgment, taking notes in her slow, deliberate handwriting. "Tell me about the last moment you remember feeling alive," she said. He thought hard. The answer didn't come from a product launch or an award or even a billion-dollar valuation. "It was a Saturday morning," he said. "My son, well, not my son. My nephew, Jamie. He was 8. He asked if I wanted to help him build a robot out of cardboard boxes." She smiled. "Did you?" "I told him I had a call, that I'd do it later." He paused, his throat tightening. "By the time I got off that call, he'd already built it without me. He said it didn't need batteries, it just needed imagination." Dr. Ramirez let the silence hang. "That sounds like the moment you started losing yourself." He looked down. "I think I lost him first." For a while, neither of them spoke. The sound of ocean wind filled the background like static. Finally, she said, "You're used to solving problems that have answers. But this isn't one of them." Evan frowned. "Then what do I do?" "Feel it," she said simply. "You've spent your whole life outsmarting feelings. Try surviving them instead." That night, Evan replayed her words by the fire. "Feel it." He poured himself a glass of water and stared at the flames dancing inside the stove. Every flicker seemed to whisper back pieces of his life. Long hours, endless applause, and that one question that never left him. When did achievement become the only way to exist? The next morning, he went back to the diner. Marlene was refilling salt shakers. "Back so soon?" "I thought you said I earned my breakfast," he said, grinning slightly. She laughed. "Coffee's on the house, philosopher." He sat at the counter watching her move, precise, grounded, present. It struck him that she'd probably worked here for decades, without needing a single headline. She wasn't chasing anything, she just was. As he took his first sip, she asked, "So, what did you used to do before fixing my espresso machine?" He froze. "Something that doesn't matter anymore." "That's the best kind of job to leave behind," she said. "Most people spend their whole lives working just to afford forgetting who they are." He stared at her, caught off guard by the quiet wisdom in her voice. And for the first time, he didn't want to run from the conversation. When he left, the sun was just beginning to set, the kind of slow golden fade that made even broken things look whole. The silence back at the cabin felt different now. Not empty, open. That night, he wrote 3 words on a napkin and pinned it to the wall above his desk. "I'm still here." And as the fire burned low for the first time in a long time, he believed it. It started as a favor. A quick repair, a little gratitude, and a free breakfast. But by the end of that week, Evan Lewis, the man once worth nearly $2 billion on paper, was officially working at a roadside diner for $10 an hour. He didn't tell anyone, of course. Not that anyone was asking. Every morning, he'd arrive at Terry's diner before sunrise. The parking lot glistened with dew, and the smell of bacon grease drifted faintly through the mist. Marlene would already be there, humming to herself, flipping chairs down from the tables. "Morning, Mr. Fix-It," she'd call, and he'd always answer, "Morning, boss." He washed dishes, mopped floors, refilled salt shakers, fixed leaky faucets, and with every small task, something shifted inside him. Something subtle, almost imperceptible. The noise that used to fill his head, deadlines, notifications, investor calls, began to fade. What replaced it was rhythm, a slow, human rhythm. Marlene had run the diner for 26 years. She'd lost her husband to cancer a decade earlier and never remarried. "Too much mess," she said. "I prefer people who leave when their coffee's done." She spoke with a dry humor that softened when she smiled, which she rarely did. But when she did, it was real. Evan liked that. There was nothing performative about her. Once, she caught him overwiping the counter. "You know," she said, "you're the first man I've seen polish stainless steel like it's a newborn baby." He laughed. "Old habits." "From what?" He paused. "Building things that didn't last." She tilted her head. "Then maybe it's time to build something that does." The words landed deeper than she intended. By his second week, Evan had memorized the regulars. There was Charlie, a retired trucker, who always ordered black coffee and a slice of pie to test if you warmed it right. Janelle, a night shift nurse who came every Friday morning and never spoke a word before her first sip. And Todd, a middle-aged mechanic who swore every time the lottery numbers came on TV, but still bought a ticket every Thursday. To his surprise, Evan liked them all. They weren't users or clients or competitors. They were simply people, unfiltered, unbranded, human. But what really anchored him was the sound, the sizzling of eggs, the hum of conversation, the clang of dishes against stainless steel. In that symphony of ordinary, he found peace. One afternoon, as he wiped down a booth, a man about his age sat down, a stranger passing through in a tailored coat that didn't belong in a place like this. He ordered coffee and looked around. "This place feels like 1985, he said. Marlene replied from behind the counter, "That's because 1985 never left." They all laughed, and even Evan. But the man's eyes lingered on him. "You look familiar," he said. Evan froze. He'd heard that phrase before, in boardrooms, on panels, in airports. "I get that a lot," he said quickly, turning away. The man didn't press, but His expression said he was still trying to place him. It was the first time Evan realized anonymity could vanish as quickly as fame had. That night, he couldn't sleep. He sat by the fire, staring at the embers, and thinking about how strange identity really was, how easily it burned down, and how quietly it could be rebuilt. He thought of the company, of Maya, of the friends who'd stopped calling once his phone went silent. He thought of the last board meeting, how no one had looked him in the eye, only at the numbers projected on the wall. He whispered into the dark, maybe that was the problem. We stopped being people and became metrics. The next morning, Marlene handed him a clean apron. You're officially part of the schedule now, she said. I thought I was just helping. You are, she said, helping me keep the place alive, helping yourself figure out why. He nodded slowly. Guess I'll see you tomorrow then. She smiled. You'd better. I can't have the espresso machine breaking again. As the sun set over the Oregon coast that evening, Evan walked down to the shore. The tide rolled in slow and deliberate, like time reclaiming what the world had borrowed. He dug his hands into the sand, feeling the grains slide between his fingers. Each one seemed to whisper the same quiet truth. Nothing truly owned, nothing truly lost. He looked out at the horizon, the sky washed in amber light, and thought, not of money, not of success, but of something else entirely. Maybe the best things in life don't scale. He stood there for a long time, the wind carrying salt across his face, the ocean's heartbeat pulsing beneath his feet. And for the first time in years, Evan Lewis didn't feel like a CEO or a failure. He just felt alive. Routine. That was the word Evan used to fear most. Back in his CEO days, routine meant stagnation. It meant loss of edge, loss of hunger. But here, in this quiet coastal town, routine felt like medicine. Steady, grounding, alive. Every day began the same way. He'd wake before dawn, light the wood stove, and watch the first line of sunlight spill across the cabin floor. Then, he'd drive 10 minutes down Highway 101 to Terry's Diner, where the smell of frying onions always hit him before the building came into view. Marlene would already be there, a towel over her shoulder, humming an old Fleetwood Mac song. Sometimes she'd say, "Morning, stranger." Other times just, "Coffee's on." He liked that she never tried to make small talk before sunrise. The diner had a rhythm of its own, a kind of choreography that never changed, but never bored him either. By 6:30, Charlie the trucker would stumble in, tapping the same corner stool with 2 fingers. By 7, Janelle would order her usual, scrambled eggs, extra toast, no conversation. By 8, the first tourists would trickle in, looking like misplaced city birds, ordering lattes the diner didn't serve. And in the middle of all that, Evan would move quietly, refilling mugs, fixing things, learning to listen. He'd spent most of his life giving instructions. Now he was learning what it felt like to serve. Once, when he refilled Charlie's coffee without asking, the old man squinted at him. "You ever work in a place like this before?" Evan hesitated. "Not exactly." Charlie grunted. "You're too polite. Guys who grew up in diners are louder." Evan smiled. "I'm still learning." "Good," Charlie said. "The world's short on learners." It was the kind of small, accidental wisdom that stuck with him longer than any TED Talk ever had. Over time, he began to notice the small rituals that made the place special. The way Marlene always wiped the counter twice after a joke, or how the cook, Roy, whistled off-key whenever he was in a good mood. It wasn't efficient or scalable or innovative. It was human. That word human kept following him everywhere lately. He realized how much of his old life had been about replacing that very thing. Automating empathy, predicting desire, reducing people to metrics and models. And now here he was, learning it all over again from the ground up. One night after closing, Marlene poured them both a cup of decaf and sat across from him. "So," she said, "you ever going to tell me what you really did before all this?" He leaned back, smiling faintly. "You wouldn't believe me." "Try me." He looked at the steam rising from the mug, thinking how strange it was that the truth felt heavier than any secret. "I built things," he said finally. "Things that were supposed to make life easier. Maybe they did, but they also made people forget how to look at each other." Marlene tilted her head. "Sounds like you sold mirrors." He blinked. "What do you mean?" She shrugged. All that tech stuff. People think it shows them the world, but it's just their own reflection. That's why everyone's so tired. They keep staring at themselves. Her words hit him like a quiet revelation. He'd built mirrors, billions of them. After she went home, he stayed behind to close up. The lights buzzed faintly, the smell of soap and coffee lingering in the air. He found himself standing by the counter, tracing his reflection in the chrome coffee pot. He barely recognized the man looking back. Not the neatly shaven CEO from magazine covers. Not the ghost who vanished on a Tuesday, but something in between. A man in transition. The next morning, the routine continued. But this time, it felt different. When Janelle smiled for the first time in weeks, he noticed. When Charlie told a story about his late wife, Evan didn't just nod. He listened. And when Marlene laughed so hard she snorted coffee, he laughed too, without restraint, without the armor of self-consciousness. It was small, almost imperceptible. But for the first time, Evan felt part of something again. That night, he wrote another note and pinned it beside the first one on his wall. The first said, "I'm still here." The new one said, "And it's starting to matter." But peace never stays untested for long. One gray morning, as he stepped out of his truck, he noticed a man parked across the road, a black sedan with tinted windows, engine idling. The driver wore sunglasses despite the overcast sky. He didn't look like a tourist. Evan felt a chill crawl up his neck. Had someone finally found him? He walked into the diner without looking back. But all day, every time the bell over the door rang, his stomach tensed. Maybe the world he left behind wasn't ready to let him go. That night, as the storm rolled in, he sat by the fire and whispered to himself, "I wanted silence." And now the silence is looking back. He didn't know yet, but that shadow outside would soon bring the past crashing through his new life. And with it, a choice he could no longer avoid. It was a Friday morning when the stranger came in. The diner was half full. Regulars in their usual seats, rain tapping softly against the windows, the jukebox humming a lazy tune from the 80s. Evan was behind the counter, wiping glasses when the doorbell jingled and the wind rushed in with a sharp gust. The man who entered looked out of place. Too polished, too awake for a town that thrived on slow mornings. Black jacket, leather shoes, expensive wristwatch that gleamed even under the dim light. He glanced around, then took a seat by the window, the booth where the sea could be seen through the drizzle. "Coffee?" Marlene asked. "Please," he said, smiling politely. "Black." His voice carried confidence, the kind people earn by standing in rooms where others listen. Evan tried not to stare, but something about the man's posture tugged at an old, buried recognition. The way he checked his watch, like every second was a negotiation. When Marlene turned to fetch the pot, the man's eyes met Evan's. "Do I know you?" he asked. Evan felt the question before he heard it. The muscles in his back tightened. "I don't think so," he said quietly. "You sure?" the man pressed, tilting his head. "You look familiar." Evan forced a smile. People say that sometimes. The stranger studied him for a moment longer, then shrugged. "Guess you just have one of those faces." He took a sip of his coffee and looked out at the ocean. Evan's hands trembled slightly as he set down the glass he'd been drying. The rest of the morning crawled by. Every small sound seemed amplified. The scrape of forks, the hiss of the griddle, the rain beating harder against the glass. When the stranger finished eating, he left a 20 on the table, stood, and adjusted his jacket. "Thanks," he said, nodding at Marlene. "Good coffee." As he turned toward the door, he glanced once more at Evan. It was brief but loaded, a look that said, "I remember now." And then he was gone. Marlene noticed. "You okay?" she asked. "Yeah," Evan lied. "You look like you've seen a ghost." He smiled faintly. "Maybe I have." That evening, when the diner closed, Evan drove back to the cabin under heavy rain. His mind replayed that glance over and over. He sat in his truck outside the cabin for a long time, engine running, wipers squeaking back and forth like a metronome for his thoughts. The stranger's watch had caught the light in a way that brought back a flash. The boardroom, 3 years ago, an investor meeting, the same kind of watch, the same nervous confidence. His chest tightened. He'd seen that face before, at Link Systems. Inside, the cabin felt smaller than usual. The fire flickered weakly, as though even it was holding its breath. He poured a glass of water and sat by the window, watching headlights flicker through the rain far down the road. The world he'd left behind, and the one with numbers and power and impossible expectations, was catching up. He'd wanted silence, but silence was never permanent. It was just the pause between questions. And the next one was already at his door. 2 days later, the stranger returned. This time, he didn't sit by the window. He came straight to the counter. Marlene was refilling sugar dispensers. Back again? He smiled faintly. Couldn't stay away. You make the best coffee in Oregon. Evan turned, ready to nod politely, but the man spoke before he could. You're Evan Lewis. It wasn't a question. The diner fell quiet. Even the sizzle from the kitchen seemed to fade. Marlene looked from one to the other. What's going on? The man extended his hand. Name's Ryan. Ryan Cates. We met at Link Systems in 2021. You gave a talk on predictive ethics. I was a junior analyst then. Evan didn't move. Ryan, he said slowly, you shouldn't be here. Ryan hesitated. You disappeared, sir. No one knew why. People say a lot of things, Evan interrupted, voice steady but low. And most of them don't matter. Ryan exhaled. You think walking away fixed everything? The company's a mess. They're using your algorithms in ways you'd never approve. People are getting hurt. The words hit harder than he expected. Marlene frowned, folding her arms. You're telling me this man's some kind of, CEO? Evan looked at her. Was. The silence that followed was thick enough to taste. Ryan leaned forward. They need you to come back. Maya's trying to hold things together, but Lynx isn't the same. You were the compass, Evan. Without you, it's just a machine running wild. Evan's jaw tightened. Then maybe it's time someone turned it off. You can't run forever, Ryan said quietly. I'm not running, Evan replied. I'm resting. Ryan shook his head. There's a fine line between rest and surrender. He placed a business card on the counter and stood. If you change your mind, call me. Then he walked out into the rain, the bell above the door giving one last jingle before the wind swallowed it. Marlene stared at Evan. You really were him, weren't you? He nodded slowly. I was. And you just left? I didn't leave, he said softly. I escaped. That night, Evan drove to the cliffs overlooking the ocean. The wind was fierce, cold, almost punishing. He stood there, soaked, staring at the dark horizon, the place where water meant nothing. Ryan's words echoed in his head. You were the compass. And now that compass had abandoned its own direction. He thought of the people still there. Maya, the engineers, the young ones who believed in the ideal before it became corrupted. Had he failed them? Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the ocean in brief silver light. In that instant, he saw his reflection in the wet stone below, blurred, ghost-like, but still there. He whispered to the storm, what if he's right? What if I didn't walk away to find peace? I just walked away because I was scared. The wind howled back, indifferent. When he returned to the cabin, he pinned another note on the wall. It joined the others. I'm still here, and it's starting to matter. The new one read, but maybe I left something behind that still needs me. He didn't sleep that night. He just sat by the fire waiting for the dawn, knowing the next step would test everything he'd rebuilt. The knock came just after sunset. 3 soft taps. Polite, almost hesitant. Evan froze mid-step. He wasn't expecting anyone. The fire in the stove crackled faintly, its light stretching long shadows across the cabin floor. For a brief second, he thought it might be Ryan again. But something in the rhythm of those knocks, familiar, deliberate, stirred a deeper recognition. He opened the door. And there she was, Maya Patel, the woman who had once sat to his right in every board meeting, who had built Link Systems beside him from a rented co-working space to a global empire. Now she stood at his door, soaked from the rain, her dark hair clinging to her jacket, her expression somewhere between relief and anger. Hi, Evan, she said. He didn't speak at first. He just stepped aside, motioning for her to come in. She hesitated, then entered. The warmth of the cabin hit her like memory. Coffee? He asked. She gave a small laugh. You still fix everything with coffee. It's the only thing I haven't broken, he said, pouring 2 mugs. For a while, they sat across from each other, the fire between them. Maya's eyes wandered over the small, simple space. The wooden walls, the napkins with handwritten notes pinned above the desk. I'm still here. It's starting to matter. But maybe I left something behind that still needs me. You really did it, she said. You vanished. Just like that. Evan exhaled. It wasn't supposed to be a performance. You left without saying a word, she said softly. The board thought you'd snapped. I thought you were dead. I needed silence. Silence? Her tone sharpened. Evan, you built something that changed how the world thinks. You can't just walk away and call it silence. The world didn't stop spinning because you got tired. He stared into his coffee. Maybe it should have. Maya's expression softened. You're angry. No, he said. I'm tired. Tired of pretending that every line of code we wrote made life better. We started with ethics, Maya. Remember that? AI that listens to people, not sells to them. I remember. So, when did it become about selling people instead? She didn't answer right away. The fire popped between them, filling the silence he'd once craved. Finally, she said, it became that way the moment you left. Without you, the board changed everything. They're using predictive behavior models in consumer finance now, selling user vulnerability data to ad firms. I fought it, but I'm one vote. Evan looked up, eyes heavy. And you came all this way to tell me that? No, she said quietly. I came to ask you to come back. He laughed, and not cruelly, but with disbelief. Come back? To what, the noise, the headlines? The same trap I crawled out of? To fix it, she said simply. To remind it what it was meant to be. He shook his head. You can't fix a machine by standing inside it. You can if you built it, she said. You're the only one they'd listen to. Evan stood, pacing slowly. You think me coming back would change their greed? You think I can undo what money already decided? She stood too, meeting his eyes. No, but maybe you can change the story they're telling about you. Right now, you're the ghost who abandoned his creation. Maybe it's time to stop being the ghost. Her words stung. Not because they were cruel, but because they were true. He'd convinced himself he left for peace, but deep down, he knew he'd also left because he couldn't bear to watch what he'd built become something else. Silence wasn't peace. It was surrender wearing a halo. He turned away from her, staring into the fire. You don't understand. I wasn't running from the company. I was running from me. Then maybe it's time you stop running, she said. Outside, thunder rolled low across the horizon. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Maya said quietly, there's something else. A journalist is doing a documentary about you. She's already been to the diner. People are talking. Evan looked up sharply. What? She says she wants to tell the truth, but you know how that goes. If you don't speak, she'll invent it for you. He closed his eyes. So I'm a story again. You've always been one, she said. The only question is, do you want to write the ending yourself or let someone else do it? Maya set a folder on the table. Papers, printouts, screenshots. This is what they're doing with your models. Take a look when you're ready. Then she put on her coat. I'll be staying at the inn by the marina. You know where to find me. She stopped at the door. Evan, if there's even one piece of you that still believes in what we built, don't let them bury it. And with that, she was gone. He sat there for hours, staring at the folder without touching it. The rain outside turned to a low, constant whisper. When he finally opened it, the first page made his stomach turn. Charts, contracts, usage reports. His creation, the behavioral algorithm, being used to manipulate debt trends, pushing vulnerable users into targeted lending traps. Every line of code he'd once written for understanding was now being used for exploitation. He whispered into the quiet, "What have I done?" The fire crackled in response, as if to say, "You already know." That night, he didn't sleep. He sat by the window, the folder open beside him, his reflection staring back faintly in the glass. The man who'd run away for peace now had to decide if peace was worth the price of silence. Because maybe silence, he realized, wasn't the absence of noise. It was the absence of courage. The morning after Maya's visit felt heavier than most. The air itself seemed to carry questions he didn't want to answer. Evan drove to the diner before dawn, the rain misting across his windshield like static. The sign buzzed faintly. Terry's Diner. Open 24 hours, and for the first time since he'd started working there, the glow of that neon felt less like a welcome and more like a spotlight. Inside, Marlene was already prepping, tying her apron. She gave him a long look. "You look like you wrestled a ghost," she said. He half smiled. "You're not far off." "Well," she said, handing him a rag, "if it left bruises, wipe 'em off the counter." The morning rush began slow. Truckers, travelers, faces he knew by rhythm rather than name. And then she walked in, a girl, maybe 17, with a notebook pressed tight to her chest. She wore a thrift store jacket, her hair tied in a messy bun, and there was that unmistakable look of teenage determination that always teetered between courage and fear. She slid into the booth by the window, the same one Ryan had used days earlier. Evan approached with his usual, "Coffee?" She nodded. "Please, and could I get pancakes? Small stack. I'm saving up." He smiled softly. "Got it." When he returned with her plate, she was already scribbling furiously into her notebook, lips moving silently as if she were rehearsing. "What are you working on?" he asked, setting the plate down. She looked up, startled. "Oh, nothing." He gestured to the notebook. "That kind of focus isn't nothing." She blushed a little. "It's an app idea." He sat at the edge of the booth, curious. "An app, huh? What for?" "It's dumb," she said quickly. "I mean, it's probably already been done." "Try me." She hesitated, then said, "It's for kids who can't afford tutors. You take a picture of your homework question, and it explains the answer step by step. But not like Google, more like a person talking to you." Evan blinked. "That's not dumb." She smiled nervously. "Yeah, well, everyone says you have to have money or a degree to make something like that. I barely have Wi-Fi." "What's your name?" he asked. "Lila," she said, "and Lila Brooks." "Nice to meet you, Lila. And trust me, money and degrees don't make ideas. People do." She tilted her head. "You talk like one of those motivational speakers." He laughed. "Maybe I used to be." "What do you do now?" He glanced around. "I make coffee. Fix things." She grinned. "You're good at it." Her compliment was simple, but it hit him harder than any award he'd ever received. Over the next few days, Lila kept coming back. Always the same corner booth, always the same notebook. She'd order the cheapest thing on the menu, then stay for hours, drawing diagrams, writing notes, muttering lines of code she'd half learned from YouTube. Marlene teased him about it. "Your little inventor's back again," she'd whisper. Evan didn't mind. Watching Lila work reminded him of something pure, that first spark of creativity before profit had poisoned it. Once, when the diner was quiet, he slid into her booth again. "You ever need help with that app? I used to know a thing or two about coding." Her eyes widened. "Really? Really? Would you look at it?" she asked, turning the notebook toward him. The pages were filled with sketches. Messy, hopeful, beautiful. She'd mapped out her entire dream with colored pens and pencil erasers. He studied it closely. "You've thought this through." "I try," she said. "But everyone I show it to says I should just finish school first." He looked at her for a long moment. Don't wait for permission to build something good. Over the next few weeks, they worked together in small bursts. He'd bring his old laptop from the cabin, show her how to structure code, how to think like an engineer, how to fail forward. She learned fast. Faster than he expected. Once, when she got a bit of code right, she jumped up from the booth, cheering loud enough for the whole diner to hear. Marlene called from the counter, "What's the celebration?" "Victory," Lila shouted. "Tiny, nerdy victory." Even the regulars laughed. Evan smiled, really smiled, for the first time in months. But one night, after closing, he caught Lila outside, sitting on the curb, her notebook clutched tightly to her chest. Her face was red, eyes glassy. He sat beside her. "What happened?" She sniffed. "My mom said I should stop wasting time. Said no one from here ever builds anything that matters." He looked out at the dark highway. "You know what's funny? That's exactly what someone once told me." "Did you listen?" she asked. He smiled faintly. I did. For too long. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. You know, Lila, when I was your age, I thought success meant becoming somebody the world couldn't ignore. But the truth is, the world will ignore you anyway. You can't live to prove them wrong, only to prove yourself right. She wiped her eyes, trying to hide the tears. You talk like someone who's been both. Both what? Successful and lost. He laughed quietly. You're smarter than you think. She smiled. That's what my app's gonna tell kids, every time they get an answer wrong. Later that night, back in the cabin, Evan stared at the napkin notes on his wall. He added a new one in his smallest handwriting yet. Maybe purpose isn't gone. Maybe it just changed its name. He looked out the window toward the highway, where the diner's neon glow still flickered faintly through the fog. He didn't know it yet, but Lila's little notebook would soon become the spark that forced him to face his old world again and decide whether the man who walked out on a Tuesday still had something left to give. It was a Tuesday again, the kind of Tuesday that felt ordinary on the surface. Quiet rain, soft jazz, on the diner radio, the smell of maple syrup and wet asphalt. But Evan had learned that ordinary days were where the biggest shifts often hid. By mid-morning, the rush had tapered off. Marlene was restocking napkins, and Lila sat at her usual booth, tinkering with code between sips of hot chocolate. The doorbell jingled. A woman stepped in, early 30s, raincoat, camera bag slung across her shoulder. Her presence carried that alert, searching energy of someone who was always looking for the story behind the silence. Hi there, she said, smiling warmly. I'm looking for a man named Evan. I was told he might work here. Evan froze mid-pour, the coffee pot steaming in his hand. Marlene answered before he could. You found him. But if you're from the IRS, take a number. The woman laughed lightly. Not the IRS, promise. My name's Claire Donovan. I'm a journalist. Independent filmmaker, actually. I'm working on a documentary about modern burnout and the people who walked away from success. Her gaze shifted to Evan. Your name's been mentioned. He set the pot down carefully. By who? Former colleagues, investors? Some admirers, she said. You've become a bit of a myth, Mr. Lewis. The man who quit billions for silence. The world wants to know why. I'm not interested in being content again, he said flatly. Claire tilted her head. You mean content as in peaceful, or content as in clickbait? That earned the smallest flicker of a smile from him. Both. Lila looked up from her booth, recognizing the name Lewis. Her eyes widened. Wait, you're Evan Lewis? The AI guy? The Link Systems founder? Evan sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Not anymore. Claire stepped closer. But you were, and your story could help people. You're the face of what everyone's too scared to admit. That success doesn't feel like success anymore. He shook his head. You don't understand. I left that world for a reason. Then tell the reason, she said gently. Otherwise, someone else will. Marlene crossed her arms. He's not some spectacle for your little documentary, sweetheart. He's a person who finally looks alive. Claire nodded respectfully. I'm not here to exploit him, ma'am. I just think his voice still matters. Her sincerity disarmed Evan for a moment. There was something genuine in her eyes. Not ambition, but curiosity tinged with empathy. Maybe later, he said finally. Not today. Fair enough. She smiled, sliding a card across the counter. But I'll be in town for a few days. If you change your mind, call me or don't. Either way, thank you for the coffee. And just like that, she was gone. The diner stayed quiet for a while after that. Lila watched Evan carefully. So it's true, she said softly. You built Link Systems. He nodded. A long time ago. And you just left? Yes. Why? He thought for a long moment, then said, because I started building machines that learned faster than I did. That night, back at the cabin, he stared at Claire's card lying on the table beside Maya's folder. Two ghosts from different worlds. The past that built him and the present trying to interpret him. He didn't know which scared him more, being found or being forgotten. He poured himself coffee, sat by the window, and watched the rain slide down the glass. Outside, The sea rumbled faintly. The same endless motion he'd tried to escape, now calling him back with its rhythm. He picked up the card and read the handwritten note on the back. The world doesn't need heroes, Evan. It needs honesty. CD. The next day, Claire returned. Not to push, but to eat. She ordered pancakes, complimented the coffee, asked Lila about her project. It turned out Claire had a degree in media design. Within minutes, she and Lila were swapping ideas about digital storytelling for education. Evan watched them from the counter, quietly moved by the sight. 2 generations of women building, dreaming, collaborating. When Claire caught his glance, she said gently, "You built platforms for connection. You just forgot to stand on one yourself." Something about her tone, equal parts truth and kindness, made him stop pretending he wasn't listening. That night, he called her. Her voice came through the phone warm and steady. "Didn't think you would." "Neither did I," he admitted. They met the next evening at the diner after closing. The lights were dim, the storm outside howling softly. Claire set up her small camera on the table, but didn't turn it on right away. "Let's just talk," she said, "no recording yet." And they did, for hours. He told her about the burnout, the hollowness of chasing numbers, the day he realized he didn't remember what his company did anymore, only what it earned. He confessed the shame of feeling worthless without his title. She listened like someone who had been there, too. When he finally paused, she asked, "If you could speak to the man in that boardroom, the one who walked out on a Tuesday, what would you tell him now?" He thought about it, then said quietly, "I'd tell him that freedom isn't found in running away. It's found in finally sitting still." Claire nodded. "That's your story, Evan. Not the man who quit, the man who finally sat still." When she left that night, she didn't take footage, just his words. And for the first time, Evan felt like telling his story didn't mean giving himself away. The next morning, he wrote another note and pinned it above his desk. Maybe truth is the only thing left worth building. He looked at the wall, at every scrap of his rediscovered self, and felt something rising again, quiet but certain. The old fire, not ambition, purpose. And that purpose was about to be tested, because by the end of the week, the world he left would drag him back, not through greed this time, but through a crisis even he couldn't ignore. It started as a headline. Maya's voice trembled over the phone when she read it aloud. "Link systems under federal investigation for behavioral data exploitation." Evan stood by the window of his cabin, phone pressed to his ear, staring out at the churning Pacific. The clouds outside looked bruised, heavy with rain and truth. "What do they know?" he asked quietly. "Enough," Maya said. "The whistleblower sent internal documents, screenshots, your old algorithms. Evan, they've been using them to profile debtors, pushing them toward predatory loans. It's worse than you think." He closed his eyes. "God, they're saying the models were designed for it, that you built them that way." Evan felt his chest tighten. "That's a lie." "I know," Maya said, "but the board doesn't care about truth. They're lawyering up. And the public, well, you know how they love a fallen genius." He hung up and sat down slowly, the phone still warm in his hand. On the table in front of him lay 3 artifacts of the life he'd tried to leave behind. Claire's card, Maya's folder, and Lila's notebook. The past, the consequence, and the future, all staring back at him. He whispered, almost to himself, "You can't stay invisible forever." That night, he couldn't sleep. The storm outside beat against the windows like restless hands. Every flash of lightning illuminated the napkin notes pinned to the wall. Pieces of himself scrawled over weeks of quiet reflection. "I'm still here. It's starting to matter. Maybe purpose isn't gone. Maybe truth is the only thing left worth building." Each one seemed to challenge him now, mocking his retreat. Had all that silence meant anything if he stayed silent now? The next morning, he went to the diner early. Marlene was already there, flipping the open sign. "You look like you haven't slept," she said. "I didn't." "Work stress?" she teased. He gave a small, bitter smile. Something like that. She poured him a cup of coffee, her usual act of quiet mercy. "Whatever it is, you'll figure it out. You always do." He looked at her. Really looked. At the woman who'd kept a place alive with nothing but grit and grace? She didn't need to change the world. She just cared for her corner of it. And somehow, that was enough. Lila arrived a few minutes later, soaked from the rain, notebook tucked under her arm. "Morning, genius," Evan said. "Morning, philosopher," she replied, grinning. "You look haunted." He chuckled softly. "That's because I am." She slid into her usual booth. "I made progress last night. The camera recognition works now. It's not perfect, but it's learning." He smiled at her enthusiasm, even as the weight of Maya's call pressed on him like a shadow. "Good work," he said. "Just remember, whatever you build it to help people, not to predict them." She frowned. "Predict them?" He hesitated, then said quietly, "That's where everything went wrong." Marlene reached for the remote, but the first few words froze everyone mid-breath. "In Silicon Valley, federal agents have raided the headquarters of Link Systems." The reporter's voice echoed across the diner, describing seized servers, panicked employees, investors fleeing. Sources claim the company used its AI to manipulate user spending behavior, targeting lower-income groups. Founder Evan Lewis has not responded to requests for comment. Every head in the diner turned toward him. Lila whispered, "That's you." Evan stared at the screen, the logo he'd once designed flashing behind the reporter, now framed by the word scandal. He stood slowly. "Excuse me," he said, walking outside into the rain. Marlene followed him to the door. "Evan," he stopped. "You can't hide from it forever," she said softly. "Maybe the only way to end the noise is to speak louder than it." He drove aimlessly for hours along the coastline, the ocean roaring beside him. Maya called again, but he didn't answer. Claire texted, "If you're seeing the news, call me. People deserve the truth." He ignored that, too. At a small rest stop, he pulled over and got out. The sea wind whipped through his hair, the rain soaking his clothes. He yelled into the storm, his voice breaking, "I didn't mean for it to become this!" But the ocean, as always, offered no reply. Back in the truck, he sat for a long time, breathing hard, eyes closed. And then he heard it. Not an answer, but an echo of memory. Lila's voice, "You talk like someone who's been both, successful and lost." Maya's voice, "You can't fix a machine by standing outside of it." Claire's, "The world doesn't need heroes. It needs honesty." Marlene's, "Speak louder than the noise." Each voice stitched itself into a truth he could no longer avoid. He turned the key in the ignition and said aloud, "No more silence." That night, back at the cabin, he cleared the table, pushed aside the empty mug, the unread papers, the distractions. He opened his laptop, the same one that had been gathering dust since the day he'd left, and began to type. No PR statement, no legal defense, just a letter, a confession. "To the people I failed," his fingers moved slowly, deliberately. He wrote about greed disguised as innovation, about how easy it was to lose morality in the pursuit of progress. He admitted that he'd walked away not because he was brave, but because he was broken. He ended it with one final line. "If our machines can learn from us, then it's time we learn from our mistakes." He signed it simply, Evan Lewis. When he was done, he stared at the words for a long moment. Then he sent it. Not to journalists, not to lawyers, but to Claire. Within hours, she replied, "This is the story the world needed. I'll make sure it's told right." He closed the laptop and leaned back, the exhaustion of truth finally setting in. Outside, the rain had stopped, and for the first time in years, the silence felt earned. The letter spread faster than any product launch he had ever orchestrated. By dawn, it had traveled from Claire's small documentary blog to national outlets. By noon, it was on every major news site. And by nightfall, the words, "If our machines can learn from us, then it's time we learn from our mistakes," had become the quote of the day across the world. The press called it the confession of the century. Analysts called it the manifesto of a fallen genius. But to Evan, it was something simpler, a man finally telling the truth after years of selling the illusion of it. The phone rang endlessly. Calls from journalists, investors, podcast hosts, documentary producers. He ignored them all, except one. Maya. Her voice was quieter this time, almost reverent. They're calling you the conscience of Silicon Valley, she said. You just turned every headline into a mirror. He exhaled. I didn't do it for that. I know, she said, but the world needed to hear it. You might have just saved what's left of Lynx. He stared at the ocean through his window. Or buried it for good. Maybe both, she said softly. Maybe that's what justice looks like. The next day, Claire drove up to the cabin. She stepped out holding a printed copy of the letter, its pages marked and folded like scripture. They're asking for an interview, she said. A live one. Tonight. They want you to explain it. In your own voice. Evan shook his head. No cameras. No stage. I said what I needed to say. Then why did you send it to me? She asked. He didn't answer. Claire's tone softened. You can't hide behind your words forever. People believe you because you sound like you've lived the consequences. Let them see the man who did. That night, as the sun set over the coast, he found himself walking the shoreline. The world felt different. Smaller, quieter, real. Every wave that broke against the sand seemed to whisper the same truth. You can run from what you built, but you can't unbuild it. He looked out toward the horizon, a long, trembling line between darkness and dawn, and said aloud, All right. The decision had already been made. The following evening, Claire's live stream began. No studio, no filters, no scripted questions. Just 2 chairs on the diner floor after closing hours. One for her, one for him. The neon sign flickered behind them, painting the scene in soft amber and blue. Marlene brewed coffee in the background, pretending not to eavesdrop, though everyone knew she was listening. Lila watched from a booth, her laptop open, her app prototype paused mid-line of code. Claire leaned forward. Evan, millions of people have read your letter. Why now? He took a deep breath. Because silence became complicity. She nodded. You walked away from everything. Wealth, fame, the company you built. What did you find out here? He looked around the diner, the counters, the coffee stains, the flicker of the sign. That success without purpose is just noise with good lighting. And peace isn't found in leaving the world. It's in learning to face it differently. Claire smiled faintly. So, what comes next? He paused. I don't know. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. The comments section on the live feed exploded. Viewers typed words like respect, finally someone honest, teach me how to start over. Somewhere in the middle of all the noise, Lila's app went live, a simple, unfinished prototype titled Learn Light. It crashed within minutes from too many users trying it. But when Evan saw her tears of disbelief, he laughed. A deep, unguarded laugh that filled the entire diner. You did it, he said. So did you, she replied. After the interview, Claire packed her camera, smiling. You realize what you just did, right? He raised an eyebrow. What's that? You turned a confession into a movement. He chuckled. I just told the truth. Exactly, she said. That's rarer than a revolution. Later that night, when everyone had gone home, Evan sat alone at his usual booth, notebook open in front of him. The diner was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the rhythmic tick of the clock above the door. He wrote one last note on a napkin and pinned it to the wall beside the others. The world doesn't need me to lead it. It just needed me to be human again. He stood there for a while, reading all the messages. The map of his journey from burnout to redemption, from silence to meaning. As he locked the door and stepped outside, the air smelled of salt and rain, and somewhere far off, thunder rolled faintly over the sea. He looked up at the night sky, vast, indifferent, beautiful, and whispered almost to himself, it all started with walking out. But maybe this is what walking in feels like. Then he smiled, pulled his jacket tight, and walked into the quiet street. No cameras, no applause. Only the hum of peace he'd been chasing for years, finally catching up to him. A month passed, then another. The media storm came and went like all modern storms do. Fierce for a few days, viral for a week, then swept aside by the next crisis. But something lingered in the silence that followed. Not the fame, not the noise. Something quieter, steadier. People began showing up. Not reporters this time, but strangers. Tired men in wrinkled suits, women with hollow eyes from too many 12-hour days, college kids questioning their majors, retirees still haunted by careers they couldn't let go of. They came from Portland, Seattle, even Los Angeles. Some flew in from New York just to see the place where the man who quit on a Tuesday poured coffee now. At first, Marlene didn't know what to do with them. "Are we a therapy group or a diner?" she grumbled, wiping down tables. "Maybe both," Evan said. The visitors weren't looking for autographs. They came for the quiet, the kind of quiet that told them it was okay to stop pretending for a while. They'd sit at the booths where Lila worked on her laptop, or at the counter where Marlene scolded regulars with affection. Some brought journals, others just stared at their coffee cups until something inside them unclenched. It wasn't long before someone posted about it online. "Terry's Diner isn't a restaurant. It's rehab for ambition." The post went viral. By the next week, a hand-painted sign appeared outside the entrance, written in Marlene's neat, slanted handwriting, "Open 24 hours, closed to lies." Evan didn't advertise it, but people started calling the visitors Tuesday Walkouts. The name stuck. Every few days, a new story appeared. A Wall Street banker who quit to teach at a community college, a coder who moved to Maine to build wooden boats, a nurse who finally took a month off and realized she'd been grieving for years. They all said the same thing when they left. "I just needed to see it was possible." And Evan would smile, shake their hands, and tell them, "It's not quitting, it's recalibrating." Lila's app, LearnLight, began to take off too. Schools started reaching out, teachers volunteering to help refine the AI explanations. When one reporter asked her how she found the courage to start, she said simply, "Someone once told me not to wait for permission to build something good." Evan heard that line on the news and smiled quietly, sipping his coffee. One evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, Marlene sat across from him in the empty diner. "You realize you've turned my place into a pilgrimage site for lost souls," she said. He laughed. "You make it sound like a bad thing." "I'm just saying, I ran this joint for 26 years, without a waiting list." He grinned. "Maybe people finally got tired of eating noise?" She looked around at the soft amber lights, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint sound of ocean wind pressing against the glass. "Funny thing," she said. "I used to think I'd die behind this counter. Now, it feels like the world came to me instead." That night, after closing, Evan stayed behind. He cleaned the counter, stacked the chairs, and paused to look at the wall by the coffee machine. The napkin notes were still there. His old words faded and yellowing, curling at the corners. Beside them, new ones had appeared, written by visitors. "Thank you for helping me start again. Left my law firm today. Haven't felt this light in years. Just needed proof that kindness still scales." He ran his hand across them, feeling the texture of so many stories pressed together. The world outside didn't change overnight. Corporations still chased profit. People still burned out. Algorithms still learned too much. But the diner became a small contradiction in a loud world. A quiet space that made people believe in something simpler, the power of stopping. Evan often thought about how strange it was, that the greatest thing he'd ever build didn't come from code or capital or scale. It came from coffee and silence. And maybe that was enough. Late one evening, as the fire in the stove crackled low, Lila joined him by the counter. "I got accepted to Stanford," she said, barely containing her grin. He smiled. "I knew you would. They want me to present LearnLight at their innovation fair. But I told them, I'm not going unless you come." He shook his head. "I'm done with conferences, kid." "It's not a conference," she said softly. "It's closure." He hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Maybe I could use a little of that." When she left, he poured himself one last cup of coffee and sat alone, listening to the hum of the diner. He looked around, at the booths, the lights, the walls covered with hope disguised as handwriting, and realized that what he'd built wasn't a company anymore. It was a compass, a place that pointed people back to themselves. He reached for a pen, found an empty napkin, and wrote his final note. "It turns out you don't lose everything when you walk away. You just make room to find what was real." He pinned it to the wall and turned off the lights. The neon sign outside flickered once, then steadied, casting its soft glow into the rain-soaked street like a lighthouse for the lost. The wind had picked up along the Oregon coast, pushing the ocean mist against the diner's windows in long, soft sighs. Inside, the fire in the corner stove burned low and steady. the kind of flame that seemed to hum more than crackle, as if it knew the night didn't need spectacle, just warmth. Evan sat beside it, the diner finally empty after another long day. The chairs were flipped, the counters wiped clean, the bell above the door silent. All that remained was the hush of the late hour, that sacred time when a place belongs to itself again. He watched the fire dance and thought about how everything in life had come down to this. One man, one quiet room, one small light that refused to die out. It had been a year since he walked out on that boardroom, a Tuesday that still felt close enough to touch. The noise of the world had never really disappeared, but he'd learned something precious about it. Noise wasn't the enemy, it was the test. You couldn't live without it. You could only learn to listen differently. He had walked away to find peace, and instead found people, the truckers, the travelers, the lost, and the learning. And through them, he had rediscovered a truth he once buried under ambition, that human connection is the only form of progress that never turns corrupt. He leaned back, hands wrapped around his coffee mug, and smiled faintly at the thought of how it all intertwined. Maya's courage to confront him, Claire's insistence on truth, Marlene's quiet wisdom that steadied the storm, Lila's faith, bright, young, unfiltered, a mirror of who he used to be before success, taught him fear. Every one of them had been a compass pointing him home, each in their own imperfect way. The world still sent letters sometimes. A CEO who wanted advice, a burned-out nurse, a teenage coder from somewhere in Iowa. They all wrote to say some version of the same thing. Your story made me stop, and when I stopped, I finally heard myself again. He never knew how to respond to that. Maybe he didn't have to. Maybe the diner, with its humming lights and smell of old coffee, had already answered for him. He stood, walked to the wall of napkin notes, and read them slowly. His own words now surrounded by hundreds of others. You made me believe in starting over. I quit today. I'm scared, but free. You helped me forgive the person I became. He ran his fingers over the paper, rough and soft all at once, and felt something stir. A deep gratitude, the quiet kind that doesn't need witnesses. This wall wasn't decoration. It was evidence that a single act of courage, even one born from exhaustion, could ripple farther than ambition ever could. Marlene appeared from the kitchen doorway, coat slung over her shoulder. You're still here, she said softly. He smiled. Someone has to make sure the fire doesn't fall asleep. She chuckled. You think too much, Louis. Maybe that's why people listen to you. Or maybe it's because I finally learned to shut up. Either way, she said, turning toward the door, you gave people something they didn't know they were missing. Permission. Permission for what? To be enough. And with that, she flipped off the last light and left, the bell above the door giving one last sleepy jingle before settling into silence. Evan stayed a few minutes longer. The glow of the fire painted everything gold. The napkins on the wall, the counter, the old coffee pot that had somehow outlasted both storms and headlines. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the pen he used for every note. One last time he tore a napkin from the dispenser, smoothed it on the counter, and began to write. We spend our lives building towers to touch the sky, only to realize the view was never the point. It's who we stood beside while we built them. He pinned it next to the others and stepped back. The fire popped softly, almost approvingly. He walked outside into the night. The air was crisp, alive with the scent of rain and salt. Above, the stars blinked faintly through scattered clouds, not dazzling, but constant. He thought about the millions still racing through life, trying to buy meaning, code it, scale it, automate it. Maybe one day they'd learn what he did. That peace doesn't come from the next thing you build, but from the moment you finally stop building long enough to see what's already standing. He smiled, breathing in the cold air. Somewhere behind him, the neon sign hummed to life again. Terry's Diner. Open 24 hours. He whispered, more to himself than the wind. Maybe that's all the world ever needed. A light that never closes. And with that, he turned toward the shore, walking down the quiet road under the soft rhythm of the waves. A man finally at ease with every choice that brought him here. We live in a world that celebrates speed, but rarely silence. We chase titles, numbers, applause, and call it progress. But maybe real progress is remembering how to listen, how to rest, how to care. So tonight, maybe we ask ourselves, would we recognize peace if it finally arrived? Or would we scroll past it, mistaking it for boredom? And when everything we've built begins to outgrow us, will we have the courage to step back, not in failure, but in faith that life can mean more than achievement? Good evening, dear listener, and thank you for being part of our little circle by the fire tonight. If the story touched your heart, share it with the ones you love. And if you'd like to listen to more like it, you know where to find us.